Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for October 30th, 2020. And on this episode, I'm going to share with you my top 15 favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes on the Constitution and liberty, along with some of his best strategic advice on how to support both as well. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can find everything you need to follow this program, all the platforms, both video and podcast editions, all the archives. I have links in every episode for you to reference things that I mention in each show, and you can even find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and I'm so grateful for everyone who is putting their financial faith behind our work. Find all that and more. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first day or you've been here since day one in every single episode, I'm very grateful for you being here. But since it's Fast Friday, let's see if I can get this done and not take up too much of your time. See if I can get it done in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Now, I broke these up into categories, and I first want to start out with some foundational principles. I guess that's a good category. And this first one comes from Thomas Jefferson in 1774, his summary view of the rights of British America. You've heard me mention this over and over and over, but I think this is an important one to start out with because if you want to live free, you have to have this approach. And he put it this way, it's a paraphrase, of course. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. If you want to live free, you don't wait for permission from government to be free from their own actions. The next one comes 10 years later, his notes on the state of Virginia in 1774. And he put it this way, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for. In other words, just because you elect people doesn't mean you're automatically free. So you could have a despotism even under elections. And this one I don't cover too often, but I really, really like it. And this was from 1789 in a letter to Francis Hopkinson. I will include links to all of these, as I mentioned, the original source documents, or at least a summary of them, so you can find them and read them for yourselves. This one, 1789, he says, if I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. And that was in a letter where he was basically disavowing being either a Federalist or an anti-Federalist. And this is the last one from this category. No, I think I have two more. Okay, yeah. This is a letter to Isaac Tiffany in April of 1819. And man, this is so spot on and it's timeless. He says, law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual. Jefferson was on board with individual liberty. He recognized that just because something was law doesn't mean that it was morally correct. And I think if you read that one in context, I will link to that letter to Isaac Tiffany in the show notes so you can read it in context. It has a little bit more punch than it already does. And this is the last one from this first category, these foundational principles on liberty. And I love this one as well. My ANCAP friends will probably recognize the principle here. He says, this was a letter to Francis Gilmer in June of 1816. He says, no man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another. This is a precursor to what many people know of as today as the non-aggression principle for liberty. Now, the next category I have here after those original foundational principles are about the constitutional structure. And here, from his opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank, Jefferson summed it up pretty well. Let me see if I can pull this up on the screen so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. And he puts it this way. He says, I consider the foundation of the Constitution. This was the pillar of the entire Constitution. In February of 1791, even before the Bill of Rights was ratified, as laid on this ground, that all power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. He considered that legal rule of construction we know as the 10th Amendment to the Constitution for the United States as the entire foundation of the full structure. And he summed up almost a similar view in August of 1800 in a letter to Gideon Granger. And I guess I got to move the image down again. Sorry about that if you guys are watching on video, but let's see if I can get this so you can read it. He says, the true theory of our Constitution, this is again, the foundation, again, the true theory of our Constitution is surely the wisest and best, that the states are independent as to everything within themselves. Those powers that are delegated to the federal government, of course, that's the federal purview, but everything else, they are independent on all the vast majority of powers. As Madison put it in Federalist 45, the powers reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. And I've got a couple here from his draft of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 against the Hated Alien and Sedition Acts of that year. And this, he said, the government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. We know, and Jefferson knew, and he warned us back then, that if you allow the government to determine the extent of its own powers, you shouldn't be surprised, no matter how many checks and balances you have, no matter how many court cases or elections or any of those things, that power would always grow as long as that government could determine the extent of its own powers. And what happens after that? He says, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And in the last category here, I'll get a little bit of his strategic advice of what to do about it, and that really ties in to this constitutional structure, these quotes that I put in this section from Jefferson. Again, these last two from the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. Now, he has a couple of warnings that, there are many. The hardest part was narrowing this down. There are many, many warnings throughout the years, but here are two that I think are really, really important. And again, it ties in to this whole structure of the Constitution of decentralization, federalism, the 10th Amendment being the foundation to the Constitution. He says here in a letter to Joseph C. Cabell in 1816, I believe, what has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun, every single government that has ever existed, at least up to that point in 1816, and I don't think things have changed since then. He says, the generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. Centralization of power was the problem. And that's why he saw, if you think about the foundation of the Constitution being something to push back against that type of thing. What has destroyed liberty? Centralization. So the foundation of the Constitution was to decentralize, as the 10th Amendment and the 9th actually codifies in law. And this other one here really backs that up as well. He says, you seem to consider the judges, this is a letter to Charles Jarvis, you've probably heard me mention before, you seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. This is the same message over and over on in different years to different people, and even on different topics, but the same consistent message that centralization of power is a problem. The courts could be part of that centralization. He thought it was actually one of the greatest ways, the greatest threat to centralizing power, to the structure of the Constitution. It would lead to concentration of power, consolidation, of course. And then, of course, decentralization is the way to advance liberty. Now, what do you do about it? This is this last segment that I want to cover. This is some strategic advice. Of course, we have to go back to the Kentucky Resolutions. I don't have a nice meme for this one because it's a little too long to get all the text on it. But he puts it this way. He says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So every time, according to Thomas Jefferson, when the federal government exercised powers not delegated to it in the Constitution, that foundation of the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, of course, tells us very clear that there's certain powers that are delegated and everything else is reserved to the states or the people. So what do you do about it? He says a nullification of the act is not just a good idea, it is the rightful remedy. And he says every state has a natural right. And of course, we know that when he's talking about the states in this situation, he means the people of the several states. They have a natural right in cases not within the compact to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits, that without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. But that doesn't mean that this type of stuff is going to be easy peasy. Jefferson knew this was going to be a very difficult road to nullify unconstitutional acts or acts that the people of the several states saw as unconstitutional. And when he sent a draft of this, or a copy of it once it was passed and signed by the governor in Kentucky, when he sent this to Thomas Jefferson, he said, look, we need to push all these principles, but of course, strategically, we should push as far as events will render prudent. That's, I guess, a bonus one, so we're going to look at 16 quotes here. But here's another one that he wrote. This was in 1790. He had a bunch of good ones that year. This is a letter to Lafayette. He says, we are not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty in a feather-bed. This is not going to be easy, and especially what we face today, the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world. It will not be simple, and it's not going to happen in a featherbed at all. And it certainly isn't for many, many people who are locked in cages by government for violating unconstitutional acts that shouldn't have existed in the first place. You've also heard this one from me many times, also in 1790, in a letter to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. This was in January 1790. He said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time is yet to get. And he actually had a follow-up to that in that same letter that I don't have up on the screen here, but let me read this because I think it just says so much. He says, it takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good. So even if you know it's the right choice, it's going to take time to persuade people to change their approach, change the things that they've learned over the years. And that leads me to my last one here. This is a letter to Charles Yancey in January of 1816. He says, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. I'll tell you what, the hardest part about putting my notes together for this episode really was to keep this to 15, something that I can get done in 10 to 15 minutes. And I actually had to eliminate a few categories, like some constitutional clauses, foreign policy, banking, debt, central banking, things like that. Paper money. If you like this kind of a topic, I've got tons of stuff on Jefferson. I could do things on other founders as well. Please let me know, whether it's in the comments here live or in the archive, or feel free to email me about this or any other suggestion you have for a future episode at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, it was quick, easy. Hopefully this was a fun one for you to watch. I hope you learned something as well. Please make sure to smash that like button. Leave us a review on a podcast platform if that's how you're hearing the program, or any other way. Subscribe, get notifications. All that stuff helps us spread the word. And if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, we absolutely couldn't get the job done without your help. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Thank you so much for being here with me. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.